Welcome to episode 8 of our study of Romans 5 through 8. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 7, verse 7 to 13, where Paul begins to explain what impact the law has on the life of a believer and more about why we need to be set free from it. Let's get started. In the opening chapters of Genesis, we read about the story of Adam and Eve in paradise, the Garden of Eden. And what's interesting is the last thing God tells us about Adam and Eve in this garden is that they were both naked and unashamed. Shame didn't exist. The shame is the idea that there's something wrong with me, that I'm flawed, I'm broken, I'm damaged, but beyond repair. And yet for Adam and Eve in paradise, there was no shame. They had no inkling, no idea, no even thought that there was anything wrong with them. But all of that changed in chapter 3. All of that changed the moment Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they were plunged, not just themselves, but all of mankind into death. And in that very moment, shame, anxiety, fear began to dominate mankind. We see that in their actions, how they hid from each other and they hid from God, and Adam blaming Eve and blaming God, trying to protect himself because there's so much shame, so much fear, and so much insecurity. And that has been the plague of mankind ever since. Men and women are trying to answer the question, am I worthy of love? Am I worthy of acceptance? And they do it in slightly different ways. For men, they're trying to figure out, do I have what it takes? Am I successful enough? Am I good enough? Am I strong enough? Am I man enough? Because then, if I am, you'll love me and accept me. For women, they ask the question a little bit different. They ask the question, am I enough and am I not too much? Am I pretty enough? Am I thin enough? Am I nice enough? Am I doing enough? Or am I too much of a mess? Do I talk too much? Do I eat too much? Do I wear too much makeup? Do I spend too much? And they're trying to find that sweet spot of being enough, but not too much. All in an effort, both men and women trying to figure out, do I have what it takes to be loved? Am I enough to be loved, to be accepted? And so to figure that out, to answer that question, we inevitably look to the world and what the world says. And the world says you can if you perform, if you measure up. And so we now are plunged into having these standards, these expectations that we need to somehow try to measure up to. That if I could somehow measure up to what's required of me, then I will be worthy of that love, that worth, that acceptance, significance, value, and security that I'm so desperate for. And so any standard that I'm looking to, any law that I'm trying to measure up to, that becomes what I refer to as our law system. You see, all of us, although we're not born under the law, unless you're Jewish, you and I as Gentiles, likely if you are a Gentile watching this, you weren't born with the law. The law was only given to Israel, the nation of Israel, but we inherited a whole other set of laws that were the equivalent. A law unto us, which Paul calls the elementary principles of this world. But essentially, it is some kind of standard that we're trying to measure up to validate or to prove that I am enough. I'm not too much, and I have what it takes. And these laws or these standards or these expectations are really a product of a few different sources. If you're like me and you grew up in the church, that might be one, or even just the church you're in today. And that's going to vary depending on which church you're part of, which denomination you're a part of, which country your church is in even sometimes. And so that begins to now flavor what's okay. Is it okay to watch movies? Is it okay to watch certain movies? Is it okay to drink alcohol? Is it not okay to drink alcohol? Is it okay to smoke marijuana or not? There's all kinds of different standards in terms of what your church will tell you as to what's okay and what's not okay, and whether you're okay or not okay. Then there's a whole other set of standards that comes from society. And society is filled with certain things that are deemed acceptable or not acceptable in terms of how we relate to one another. And now we start to have some conflict sometimes between what the church says is okay and what society says is okay. And now we're in some bit of a dilemma. We're in some conflict here. But then there's a whole other set, which is what our family of origin says. Be it your parents, your siblings, your grandparents, or even now the family you're a part of today. What's okay? What's acceptable? Do you have to have an education? And to what degree do you have an education? Is college enough? University? Or do you need a postgraduate degree? What job is okay? Is it okay that you're a factory worker or a tradesman or a white collar worker? Or do you need to be a doctor or a lawyer? And how successful do you need to be? These are all things that sometimes our family begins to, sometimes unspoken, but nonetheless is placed on us. And then we have our own set of laws, our own personal set of expectations of what we demand of ourselves. The car we drive, the trips we go on, how our family behaves, the income we make, the clothes we wear, the way my body looks. All sorts of different things that we're constantly striving for, hoping that if I could check all these boxes, then I'll be all right. And so let me illustrate to you this way with this diagram. We all have these standards, and your standards are going to be unique to mine. You're going to have your own set of laws. I have the law of Ross, so to speak, and you all have your own set of standards. But here are some generic ones that I see in various people's lives as I've met with them. Certain expectations they have, things like be happy. It seems simple, but yet they're supposed to always, be happy. Especially you see that on social media, that they're supposed to be a positive person. Or maybe they have another one of serving in a ministry or having a perfect family where their kids are behaving well and doing well in school and well in sports so that all that can be broadcast on social media so everyone will know that they're good parents. Be successful in their jobs, at home and school, to be able to have enough faith, whatever that means, to not doubt, to not question, but to always be smiling and trusting God, to give money, to tithe, to make sure they're supporting their local church, supporting local ministries, and then even helping sponsor kids overseas, reading their Bible enough, going to church, praying enough. See, all these things that we've got listed, none of it's bad per se. In fact, none of it is really actually bad. It's just these are the standards. And these standards, you'll know you have them because you'll end up beating yourself up when you fail to measure up. When you feel like you haven't prayed enough or read your Bible enough or that your family's not behaving well enough and you begin to get down on yourself. These are the standards that we have. And so what happens is we begin to evaluate, how am I doing? How am I measuring up? And so we kind of give ourselves a score between 0 and 10. How happy am I? How successful am I at serving in this ministry? Or how successful are my kids behaving well? And what kind of a parent am I? And so these standards or these expectations we're using to evaluate, am I okay? And if my scores are high, then I'm hopefully doing well, but room for improvement. But what ends up happening is how much is enough keeps moving. See, if I'm successful right now, then the target moves and I need to become more successful. And maybe I had an 8 before, but the 8 becomes now a 5 as more is demanded of me, more is expected of me. And the problem with this system is that no matter how hard you work, no matter how hard you strive, because the goalposts keep moving, it's never enough. More is always required. And so I see my success and I feel somewhat good about that, but then I realize the degree to which I'm failing. And I feel miserable about my failure. And what I do often is I turn to God and I say, God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for my failure. I'll do better. Thank you for forgiving me, but I'll do better tomorrow. And we start over and hoping to improve our score. The problem with this system is it's not Christian. It's not a new covenant system. Really what this is it's an old covenant system that we've tried to soup up with a Christian label on it. But there's nothing Christian about it. Because what it's doing is essentially what the old covenant, the Jews were doing. Think about it. For the Jews, they would have had their 613 laws across the top. And they would have done their best to try to measure up. And then when they failed, they'd offer their sacrifice and they would try again. And for so many Christians, all they've done is they've taken the old covenant, Judaism, and they've souped it up with a different sacrifice. They'll have maybe the 10 Commandments and a whole bunch of other laws like we've talked about. And then they do their best, hoping to measure up, and then they fail. But instead of offering lambs and goats like the Old Testament do, we've got Jesus. That's better, right? Only to try again. And the problem with this system is it's sort of like running on a treadmill. No matter how hard you run, no matter how hard you go, you end up nowhere but tired and exhausted and beat up and condemned and more shame, more failure, more insecurity, more fear, more worthlessness. Because the whole system is flawed. The whole system doesn't work because it's a law-based system, not a grace-based system. And so what shall we say, Paul says now in this passage in Romans chapter 7. And it's for this reason that you and I needed to be set free from the law, set free from this law system in order that we could live in a new way. And Paul's been saying that how we still serve, but we serve in a new way now, not according to the letter, not according to a standard, not according to these expectations, but rather we serve now according to the Spirit. Now, Paul knows that people are going to have this major question now, this question of, is somehow we saying that the law is bad then? Is the law wrong? Is the problem the law? And so Paul's going to answer that now in this section. In verse 7 to 13, he's going to begin to show to us that the problem is not the law, but sin. But that God brought the law in not as a way to live, not as a pathway to sanctification or a guideline to follow or rules to live by, but for something else, to drive us to Jesus. And so that's what we want to look at. We want to now discover what was God's plan for the law. What was his purpose in the law, in giving the law? So in Romans chapter 7 and verse 7, Paul says this, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. Again, he asks the question and he knows it's going to be asked, and he answers it right off the bat. May it never be. God forbid. Absolutely not. The problem is not the law. He goes on to say, on the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So Paul here, he's using one of the 10 commandments. And I think that's so important because theologians, what we've done is we've divided the law into 3 segments. There's the moral law, which includes the 10 commandments. And then there's the civil law and the ceremonial law. And they said, well, when Paul says we're not under law, he means the civil and the ceremonial. We don't have to do the hand washings and the feasts and take care of your neighbor's vineyard if the oxen went into that. We're freed from that, but we surely still have the 10 commandments. Well, it's the 9 commandments because we don't honor the Sabbath the way the Jews do. So it's the big 9 instead of the big 10. But what Paul does is he's actually saying it's the whole law we've been set free from. Because while theologians may try to slice up the law, God doesn't. It's the whole law. It's the entire law system we've been set free from. And so he chooses, you shall not covet, which is from the 10 commandments, to show why we can't live under the 10 commandments even. Never mind any part of the law. And the first purpose we see here is that what the law does is it's there to make us aware of what is sin. It's defining sin for us. You see, it's really easy for people to especially today, but it's always been easy for people to have a very relative view on what's wrong, on what's sin. In fact, even to this day, there are some Jewish people who view sin differently in Jerusalem versus outside of Jerusalem. It's sort of like the reverse of Vegas. What happens outside Jerusalem stays outside Jerusalem. And so if you leave Jerusalem, you can behave in a very sinful manner, and it's okay. You just have to be clean and upright the moment you step into Jerusalem. We see that people acting certain ways on Sunday morning and very differently on Monday night. And so there's a relative aspect to it. And so what God does is he says, let's be clear. Let's be really clear. This is wrong and this is sin. So the first thing it does is it defines it for us. In essence, what it's doing is it's defining us by measuring it up against who God is. See, think back to the garden. In the garden, there was this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the temptation was, eat of this tree, know what's right, know what's wrong, and you too can be like God. That was the lie. That was the deception. And I almost wonder if God said, okay, you want to be like me? Here's a law, simple law. 10 commandments to start, 613 other ones. There's more. But let's just start with this. And let's see if you can somehow be like me. Knowing what's right, knowing what's wrong. Here you go. And he's defined it so we now know this is the standard. This is the target. As you may have heard, the Greek word for sin is harmatia, and it's an archery term, and it means to miss the mark. And so it means that there needs to be a mark, there needs to be a bullseye in order we know whether we hit it or not. And so that's the first thing the law does, defines it. See, Paul's saying here in this verse 7, that I didn't know coveting was wrong. You know, coveting is one of those things where it's all happening in our mind. Whether I'm lusting after a woman, or I'm lusting after a man, or I'm lusting after someone's house or their job or their family. Coveting is all happening in here. And in many ways, people have justified it, saying it's the victimless crime. I'm not cheating on my wife. I'm just dreaming about what it'd be like to be all these other women. And Paul's saying that what the law does is it actually tells me this is wrong. That even to lust after someone else in that way, or to lust after what they have in that way, that would be sin. And so that's what the law does. We have that in our own world today. We have a number of written rules and written codes of conduct that are there to help us define what's right and what's wrong. For example, you're driving along on a road, and if there's no speed limit, you could drive at whatever speed you want, and you could drive at 200 miles per hour if you had a car that could go that fast. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. So we introduced a law that says to drive at 60. And now knowing that if I go above 60, I'm breaking the law, because 60 now is what's deemed to be an acceptable or a safe speed. So that's what the law does. The first thing is it's simply defining what's right, defining what's wrong, defining the target. The reality is it doesn't matter how much you miss the target, though. I like this illustration. Imagine someone's waiting for their bus or coming to take a bus, but they missed the bus by just 1 minute. I mean, they were the guy running to make the bus, but the bus driver just drove off. Either didn't see him or just likes to have fun with people sometimes. So they missed the bus by 1 minute. 20 minutes later go by, still waiting for the next bus. Someone comes running up, out of breath. Did I miss the bus? Did I miss the bus? And the first guy there starts laughing at him. Oh, buddy, you weren't even close. I mean, you missed it by a good 20 minutes. I mean, me, I was so close. I only missed it by 1 minute. You, not even close. Think about it. Is the guy who missed it by 1 minute any better off than the guy that missed it by 20? You both missed the bus. And that's the way that sin is. If you miss the target, you miss the target. Because it's not being graded on a scale, it's pass-fail. And so whether you miss it by just this much or you miss it by this much, you missed it. And so what the law is saying, here's the target, take your best shot. And so every one of us then takes our best shot, but look what happens. Instead of getting closer or actually maybe achieving that goal, achieving that target, look what Paul says happens. Let's go back to verse 5 of chapter 7 and be reminded of what we see here. For Paul says, for while we were in the flesh. Now he's taking us a moment back. Remember, I said this whole passage is all about our life in Jesus and our relationship to the law now. But in verse 5, he's just taking a step back and saying, while we were in the flesh, before you met Jesus, before you became a believer, when you and I were still in Adam, he says, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in the members of our body to bear fruit for death. Now, verse 5 is speaking about an unbeliever, but verse 6, he says, but now, he's transitioning, but now back into salvation, and that's what we're going to see the rest of the passage. But for a brief moment, he's saying, when you were an unbeliever, when you're an Adam, what did the law do? It didn't clamp down on sin. It made it worse. It made it bigger. And so verse 7 then, so he says, is the law bad? Is it sin? May it never be. I would not have come to know the law. I would not have come to know what was sin except through the law. But look what he says now in verse 8. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Sin is powerless. Sin has no effect apart from the law. See, the second purpose that God brought the law in is what we saw earlier in Romans 5:20, that the law was added so the transgression not would decrease, but would actually increase. And so what he says here, the second purpose is that the law, it stirs up, it arouses sin, making it increase in order to reveal death and my need for life. You see, when we arrive here on planet Earth, we kind of think we're not that bad. And often we're comparing ourselves to other people and we're thinking, I'm certainly not as bad as that person. So I'm doing okay. And so what the law does is it amplifies the problem. And in many ways, what the law is, it's one of those mirrors that ladies use to put on makeup. You know the ones I'm talking about, where it's not just a mirror, it's one of those magnifying mirrors. And for added benefit, it's got a nice bright light around it, just to shine a light on us. And so what is that mirror doing is it's showing up on our face to expose all the flaws and all the imperfections, except it magnifies it and makes it stand out even more. I mean, you can now see the dirt in the pores waving back at you. And that's what the law was doing. It wasn't in any way trying to reduce sin, it was magnifying it. It was throwing gas on a fire to make the fire bigger. Why? To expose that there's a fire there in the first place. That's what the law was trying to do, not trying to control it in any way. You see, the deception is this, that, like I said, that what the world offers to me, it says, if you can perform well enough, if you can measure up to these standards, then you'll find life. You'll find acceptance. You'll find love. You'll find worth and security and belonging. Everything you've been chasing after for, you will find if you're good enough. So look what Paul says in verse 9. He says, I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive and I died. Let's understand. Let's take a moment here and pause and understand. What does Paul mean when he says, I was once alive apart from the law? Think about that. When was Paul alive apart from the law? Now, Paul was a Pharisee, which means at a very young age, he would have been studying the scriptures, studying the law, putting it to memory, and following it as best he could. And so some have surmised, well, that was before Paul became a Pharisee. Well, when Paul arrived here on planet Earth, did he arrive alive or dead? As we saw in Romans 5, he arrived here born dead because he was in Adam still. That Paul didn't receive life until the moment of salvation. And so when he's saying that he was alive apart from the law, it had to be after salvation. It had to be after the road to Damascus. And so I imagine there was a period of time where, like most new Christians, when they get saved, at first, all they care about Jesus. Is Jesus this? Is Jesus that? And there's this initial, I don't want to say infatuation because it belittles it, but there's the initial focus and concentration and just this deep love for Jesus and only Jesus. It dominates their thinking and their mind. And that's what Paul had. He was just so enamored with Jesus and Jesus' love for him. That's all he just trusted Jesus. He was alive apart from the law. But then the commandment came. The commandment specifically, thou shalt not covet. And sin became alive and he died. Why? Verse 10 and 11, this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me. For sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, deceived me and through it killed me. See, here's the thing. What sin does is it comes along and it offers to me a solution. It offers to me a way to find life. It says, if I perform well enough, I'll be better accepted. In Paul's case, I think Paul looked at it and he thought, you know what? If I don't covet, I'll be a better Christian. Brilliant. I mean, think about it. How many other sins result first from coveting? I mean, most murder is a result of coveting. Most stealing results from coveting. Most adultery results surely from coveting. If I could just master don't covet, I would wipe so many sins off the table. I would be a better Christian. And it's all a lie. It's all deception. That sin's playing. Because sin's goal is trying to put you and I back under law. Why would it do that? Because remember, apart from the law, sin is dead. Apart from the law, sin is powerless. But the moment you and I turn to the law, the moment you and I turn to these standards, turning to our own abilities as a result to measure up to these standards, sin is empowered. Sin becomes engaged. As one theologian says, when we turn to the law, it's like poking a tiger with a stick, only to discover that tiger wakes up and devours us. And so I'm trying to use the law, a stick, to overcome this tiger, but it devours me as a result. So sin becomes alive. It devours me, it defeats me, and through the law, sin kills me. Again, that death there just means that I experience death, as we talked about in Romans chapter 6. I just become miserable and a failure and not good enough and condemned, and more shame and more insecurity and more fear. And this commandment, look what Paul says, this commandment that I thought was going to be life to me. I thought it was the answer to my prayers, only proved to be death to me. That's why we're drawn to the law. But realize this, beloved, that the law only has one outcome for you and I as a Christian. It's sin being empowered and our experiencing death. Verse 12, so then, the law is holy. The commandment is holy and righteous and good. He's not saying that the law is bad. He's recognizing it. He's restating what he said in verse 7. There's nothing wrong with the law. It's holy, it's righteous, it's good, it's perfect. Verse 13 though, therefore, did that which is good become a cause of death for me? Is the problem the law? May it never be. The problem is not the law. Rather, it was sin. In order that it might be shown to be sin, by affecting my death through that which is good, so that through the commandment, sin would become utterly sinful. Remember what we said, the second purpose for the law was to arouse sin, to make sin increase, to make it more obvious, to reveal to you and I our desperate need for life, to expose to you and I how badly we need Jesus. And that's the third purpose now. The third purpose of why God gave the law wasn't to provide salvation, but rather to point us to the one who could. So the third purpose is the law becomes our child guide to lead me to Jesus for salvation. This is shown to us in Galatians chapter 3 in verses 22 to 25. Here Paul writes that the scripture has shut up everyone under sin. That's what he was saying earlier in this book of Romans. So that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ. That word tutor, other translations use the word teacher. I don't like either of those. Because tutor or teacher seems to imply that it's actually an instructor for us now how to live. The Greek word there is paidagogos. And a paidagogos was essentially what we would call today a governor or a governess or a nanny. They often were portrayed in Roman times as having a stick in their hand. You see, what a wealthy man would do is he would hire this paidagogos, a servant, to look after his children. But the paidagogos, their job wasn't to teach the child. Their job was basically to keep the child in line. And that's where that stick came in handy. See, if the child is misbehaving, then whack. They'd whack the child. Wake up. Get to school. Do your work. Stop picking on your sister. Eat your vegetables. Go to bed. And every time that child would step out of line, they'd get the smack. And that's exactly what the law was doing to you and I. The law was our paidagogos. I like the term child guide, because what it's doing, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, 8 to 10, it was a minister of death, a minister of condemnation. It's beating us up. And what eventually happens to you and I is it constantly, time and time again, says you're failing, you're not measuring up, you're not good enough, you're blowing it. That I reach a point where I realize this isn't going to work. That I cannot get to where I want to be, which is to be loved and accepted, to be worthy of that love and acceptance, to have what it takes, to be enough and not too much, by trying to measure up to standards. There's got to be a different way. And praise God there is. So he goes on to say in Galatians 3, therefore the law has become our tutor, our child guide to lead us to Christ so that we may be justified by faith. But watch what he says, but now that faith has come, we're no longer under a tutor. We don't need the child guide. We don't need the law anymore because faith's come. Jesus has come. We don't need the law to beat us up, to try to keep us on track, keep us on the right place. We've got Jesus for that now. You see, the law has served its purpose. The moment you come to faith in Christ, the law is obsolete because there's a new covenant now, a new way of operating, a new way of serving by the Spirit, not by the letter. See, beloved, the law is not made for you and I anymore. It's served its purpose. It's led you to Jesus. Now let Jesus be Jesus. See, Paul was teaching this in his letter to Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning in verse 5, he says this, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. I love that passage. Beloved, I want you to know the goal in this series and me presenting all these videos, it's not to make you a smarter theologian or wiser about the Bible, although that's part of it. My ultimate goal is that you will learn to love better. Love God, love yourself, and love other people from this pure heart. This righteous new creation you are. From a good conscience, new desires, new want-tos, from the new spirit, the new person you are, in a sincere faith, trusting in Jesus to do all of that through you. That's my goal. That's my goal every time I go to teach. But look what he says in verse 6, but some men, straying from these things, have turned aside to a fruitless discussion. What's a fruitless discussion? That this teaching that was not going to bear any fruit of life. Well, what were they teaching? Verse 7, wanting to be teachers of the law, even though they do not understand either what they are saying or the matters about which they make confident assertions. See, the law doesn't actually lead to life. And they make all these confident assertions. If you implement these 3 things, these 7 things, these 6 principles, if you start giving and tithing to the church, and if you read your Bible every day and you pray every day and all these shoulds and have tos and musts, then you'll have life. But what does the law do? Empowers sin, stirs it up, which instead of providing life only ministers death to me. And so I experience more failure, more shame. Because I just can't do enough. I can't read my Bible enough. I can't pray enough. I can't go to church enough. I can't give enough. I can't serve enough. I can't be successful enough. Because the target's always saying more. But we've been set free. He goes on to say in 1 Timothy 1:8, but we know the law is good. That's what Paul has been saying in Romans 7. The law is holy, righteous, perfect, and good. There's nothing wrong with the law. If one uses it lawfully. If one uses it properly. If one uses it what it's meant for. You see, every tool has a purpose. A hammer is meant to drive in a nail. A screwdriver is meant to drive in a screw. A saw is meant to cut the wood. But you would never use a hammer to cut wood. You would never use a screwdriver to drive in a nail. It just doesn't work that way. A tool is only useful for when it's used properly. And the same is true with the law. The law as a tool was not a method to live by. It's not meant for you and I. It's meant for the unbeliever. He goes on to say in verse 9, realizing the fact the law was not made or is not made for a righteous person. Who are righteous people? As we've been seeing in Romans 5, it's anyone who's in Jesus. Not based on what they've done, but based on Christ's obedience and their faith and trust in what he's done for them and on their behalf. And because of that, you and I are now in Jesus and we've been made righteous. So the law is not made for us. Well, who is it for? But those who are lawless and rebellious, for ungodly and sinners, for unholy and profane, those who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for immoral men and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. It's made for the world. It's made for the unbeliever. It's made to show to them how badly they need Jesus, how badly they need to rely upon Christ for their salvation, that their striving and their effort will never quite make it there. But the moment they come to Jesus, the law has accomplished its goal, it's accomplished its purpose, and now they can get on this new life, trusting and walking with Jesus, and see the beauty that's going to come from that. And so again, what's Paul saying? What's the whole point of Romans chapter 7? He's making the case to show and prove that you and I, we don't need the law. Instead, we've got Jesus. I know that for some of you, this is going to be a big struggle and it's going to be a big challenge. But here's what I want to encourage you to do. Again, read through this passage in Romans chapter 7, just these first 13 verses. Read them slowly. And if you're still not convinced, then I invite you to go and read Galatians. In particularly, read Galatians chapter 2, beginning in verse 17, all the way into chapter 4. Because see, in chapters 3 and 4 in particular, Paul's making the case of why you and I needed to be set free from the law. Not as unbelievers, but as believers, why we don't go back to the law. You've got freedom, beloved. Freedom now from the law to live in and from Jesus. Because Jesus has made you enough. He's made you righteous. He's made you holy. He's made you perfect and good. Which means the question, am I worthy of love? Do I have what it takes? Am I enough? Am I too much? The answer is you're perfect. You are loved and accepted, and shame now has no basis to accuse you because of who you are in Jesus and who Jesus is in you. And if you remove the law, there's no more standards anymore. And now you can rest in his love. And that's his invitation. Think about what he said in the Gospel of Matthew. To all who are weary and heavy laden. Specifically there, the context is the law. To all those who are struggling under the law, he invites them to rest. Come unto me, for my burden is easy and my yoke is light. Rest in me. That's the offer. I hope you're seeing that law has a purpose and has a role to play today, but not in the life of a believer. That role has been played already, and now we have something better than the law. We have Jesus. In our next episode now, we're going to look at one of the most famous passages in all of Scripture, in the second half of Romans chapter 7. But until then, would you consider sharing this video with your friends and family so that they too can understand the freedom they have in Jesus? And if you're led by the Lord, go visit our website, crossways2life.org, and there you can support this ministry. We've been able to offer these videos for free so as many people can know the freedom they have in Jesus, but we would love to be able to make more videos or more teaching available such as these. Thank you. Have a great day.